Hi, I'm Philip Brunton and welcome to Jazz Plate lesson number 8. Today we're going to be looking at the bebop era and the chord progressions associated with that. Now the bebop era was a move away from the big band era where now we just had a rhythm section and maybe a couple solo horns. And because of the freedom of this smaller group, the soloists were able to play much more quicker chord changes, virtuosic improvisations. Now in bebop, the main melody just became like a starter and the main course was the improvisation. Now it's worth noting here that all the preceding lessons of Jazz Plate have progressively led us to this point of bebop improvisation. So hopefully your chords and scales are really fluent by now. If not, I highly recommend going back to earlier lessons and make sure these scales and chords are fluently into your fingers. Even going back to lesson 7 where you introduce the major scales, get those really fluent on page 1 of lesson 7. So there's lots to cover in this bebop lesson, so let's get started with looking at your worksheet, page 1. At the top you'll see what's called the diatonic 7 chords. These are chords that you create that are all diatonic or in the key, related to the key, in this case C major scale. So what you can see I've done here, from every note, every degree of the C major scale, there's a 7th chord presented. So on the 1 chord, we use the Roman numerals here for each degree. On the 1 chord, you'll create a major 7 chord. On the 2, a minor 7, 3 is a minor 7, 4 is a major 7, 5 is a dominant 7, 6 is a minor 7, 7 is a new type of chord, a minor 7 flat 5. It's like the minor 7, but the 5th, instead of being a perfect 5th, you have a lowered. So if you hear degree of the just compare that to the minor 7th, and then, okay, so that's a minor 7 flat 5. All these chords are built from the major scale, in this case the C major, and so they say they're diatonic 7 chords to C major. So when you make diatonic 7 chords from any scale, you will always find the 1 is major 7. You will find that the 2 is going to be minor 7, the 5 is always going to be dominant 7, the 7th will always be minor 7 flat 5. So that's a pattern that's consistent with all major scales. Now since most of the tunes you'll be playing are going to be in a major key, then it's worth getting to know your major scale fluently into your fingers. So here's a chance in our warm-up to play through our tetrachords to get to know every key. Now before we play, let's have a tuning note, concert A, 440. So this is our warm-up, playing through all the major keys, and as before, we're using tetrachords, 2 together create 1 major scale. The next thing we're going to do is some diatonic 7th patterns. You'll see that the next thing on the worksheet is the key signature clock. And we're going to use this to work out our diatonic 7ths in different keys. I remind you to go back to lesson 7 if you can't remember how we use this clock. But you'll see underneath it we have a C major scale, 2 octaves, and I put some diatonic 7ths up through most of these notes. And it's just diatonic 7 chords you're just creating 1, 3, 5, 7 from every degree of the scale. What you're going to do is find your starting note, and in the first one example we're going to give a C major, so that's at the very beginning, and you're going to identify your key signature, and we know that's at 12 o'clock so that you can see no sharps, no flats. And your pattern in this case is going to be ascending the chord 1, 3, 5, 7 and scale down in the key that you need to be down to the next chord. So it's going to be chord up, scale down, chord up, scale down, and you work your way through one octave this way. So here's an example in the key of C major. If we're going to play now the diatonics in D major, we find our starting note, which is the second degree there of that big scale I've shown. And we find our key signature. We find D is at 2 o'clock, 2 sharps. So we got F and C sharp. And so we're going to go starting from the starting note, up the chord, down the scale, up the chord, down the scale for one octave. And you get this. So it's a great way to practice your chords and your scales at the same time. Now there are many different diatonic 7th patterns, but this is a great introduction because it covers the chord and the scale at the same time. Now I recommend you going through all 12 keys, but if you're playing a particular tune, you know what key you're in, definitely run through the diatonic 7ths in that specific key. Now let's go on to page 2 of your worksheet, and we're going to look at the functions of every diatonic 7th chord. When we say something is horizontal, that's melodically, we're hearing it. And if it's horizontally unstable, it says here that the 4th note of the key requires movement. When you hear that 4th note of the 4th degree of a scale, it has this feeling of instability. It needs to melodically maybe move down to the 3rd. The 4th note, if you remember in the past we've talked about, is called the avoidance note. And when we hear vertically a sound as a chord, we have an unstable tritone heard sometimes. That's this sound that usually needs to resolve. And that's instability vertically. And we get our functions by looking at where the stability and instability is. So if we look at tonic function chords, they're horizontally and vertically stable chords. These include the 1 chord, the 3 chord, and the 6 chord. Subdominant function chords are horizontally unstable. They include that 4th note, but they're vertically stable. They don't have the tritone. And so these include the 2 chord and the 4 chord. And finally we have the dominant function chords, and these are the 5 chord and the 7th chord. They are unstable horizontally, they include the F, and unstable vertically because they include that tritone sound. And you'll see that presented on the diatonic 7ths. I've shown you each chord at the top of the page there. And underneath you'll see T for tonic function, SD for subdominant function, and dominant function with the D. Okay. Now tonic function chords have a nice sitting feel. Subdominant chords give a sense of direction, and dominant functions need movement. And because of these functions, we're able to create chord progressions. And this is where we're leading to now. And this leads us to the most common bebop chord progression of the 2-5-1 progression. The 2 being a subdominant function, which will give a sense of direction towards the dominant function 5 chord, which definitely needs to be resolved to the 1 chord, which is the tonic function, the 2-5-1 progression. So here's an example of the 2-5-1 progression in the key of C major. I'll use the patterns that we were learning before, going up the chord, down the scale, and you'll see this in the key of C major, 2-5-1. Okay, and the key of D major, so now I got 2 sharps, 2-5-1 is E minor 7 going to A7 to D. And one more, I'll give you F major. So these are the 2-5-1 progressions, and we're going to get to know those in every key soon. We're going to improvise with those. Okay, so how do we improvise over the 2-5-1 progression? Now you'll remember from lesson 7, every chord has a mode attached. The 2 chords are going to be Dorian modes, the 5 chords are the Mixolydian, and the 1 are the Ionian. But because these 2-5-1s all link together so well as a progression, all we need to know is what key we're in, and we'll use that major scale to improvise through the whole thing. So you don't need to think individual chords, they all work together as ones. Now these jazz plate lessons have also made use of the phrase structures. I talked about the 4, the 2+2, and the 1+1+2. And they're also helpful for improvising with over the 2-5-1s. So I'm now going to give you 3 examples using the 2-5-1s in the key of C. First time is a 4-bar phrase where my long note is going to be heard in relation to the C major 7. On the 2 and 2, I'm going to have a long note in the middle, so one long note is going to be heard in relation to the G7 chord, and then at the end back to the C major. And finally, I'm going to hear a long note on each chord, so the D minor 7, my long note has to be reflecting the D minor 7 chord, the G7, and also the C. So it's important to know your chord tones plus your basic diatonic scale notes. So now, looking to page 3, we're going to improvise in all keys the 2-5-1 progression. So you can see on page 3, we have the 2-5-1 progression. I've shown the diatonic 7th chord laid out for you on each chord, plus at the end the scale, so it helps you. So this exercise, improvising in 2-5-1, is going to assume that you can play all your major scales fluently. And if you're not there yet, I recommend you going back to lesson 7, page 1, where we had some exercises to practice through using the key signature clock and getting around your scales on your instrument. Okay, so in this 2-5-1 progression exercise, I'm going to play the first line and then it repeats where you play. I'll do a phrase structure. You're welcome to repeat my type of phrase structure, or you come up with your own if you wish. Just remember, when you choose a longish note or the note preceding any rest, that's going to be heard in relation to the chord. So I'm not saying you can't play any specific notes, but you'll know some notes don't sound as good as others. If you do play a note that has much more clash, just resolve it. of you might have actually noticed in line 11, I played what might be considered a wrong note, a note that's not part of my key. But not to worry, because when you're playing, you may find you hit different notes. They just add more color. Don't call it a wrong note, it's just added color. Now our improvisation in bebop is just not limited to the 2, the 5, and the 1 chords. On page 4, you'll see I've shown you all the diatonic 7 chords with the according scale, or the mode. So you can see the one uses the Ionian, and here we're starting in the key of C major, I've shown them, and then also in the key of D major, so you can compare how they're the same, but just from a different starting note and the key structure. Now, what happens when you do want to go outside of the key? In classical music, we would say we're modulating to another key, but in jazz, we don't modulate, we just hint at different keys. And this gives rise to the secondary dominants and the secondary 2-5. Basically, any diatonic chord can be preceded by its dominant 7th chord. So you see the first example there for secondary dominant chords. We have a 2-5-1 at the end of that line, and the 2 chord, the D minor 7, is preceded by an A7 chord. That's the dominant 7th of D. Now that hints at 2 sharps of D, even though we're in key of C major, little hints of D major. Later in another lesson, we'll be talking about how we can actually hint a minor sound, but in this case, we're just going to hint at the major sound of D major on that A7 chord, and then back into C major tonality. So here's an example of the secondary dominant. Now you can also take any diatonic chord and precede it by its 2 and 5 chord. So here's our next example. We have our E minor 7 going to A7, which happens to be the 2-5 of the D minor 7. And then we go right back into the 2-5-1 of C major. And you can extend these secondary dominants further backwards. So the secondary dominant can have preceded by its dominant and preceded by its dominant. And you can also do that with its 2 secondary 2-5 chords as well. So here's an example. I have the 2-5 of the secondary dominant, the A7, which then works its way to the D minor 7, G, and C. So we're in the key of C major, but just before we're hinting at D major, and before that we're hinting at A major. We're not changing keys, we're just hinting at those different keys. We're not modulating to different keys in improvisation chord progressions, we're just hinting at these new keys. So here's the example. Okay, it's your turn to improvise now. It's over a chord progression of a tune. Now, you remember in lesson 6, we used a pentatonic scale over rhythm changes, a well-known bebop chord progression. And we're going to do the same this time, but not with one scale fits all. We're actually going to be playing diatonic 7 chord scales. So let's have a look at rhythm changes on page 5. You'll see that the 1 chord is started at the beginning, the 1 major. So we know what key we're in. For me, it's G major on my alto saxophone. Depending on what key you're in, your worksheet will show. Okay, so I have 1 major 7, and then I have the 2-5. So for the first 2 bars, we have our 1 and our 2-5, and then the next bar is a secondary 2-5 of the next bar's 2-5. You'll see that's shown as a bracket. When we have our 2-5, we show this as in a bracket and then an arrow to where its direction is. So for the 3rd bar, we'll be hinting at a different tonality, and then we come back to the 2-5. Then we're into the 2nd line. We have a new tonality of a 2-5 working its way to the 4 chord of the original diatonic chords. Okay, and then the first time bars we have, again, just like those earlier 2 bars, we have our extended 2-5 going to our regular diatonic 2-5. And then we repeat the whole process again, And on the second time bar, we just have our 2-5-1. So when you're improvising, you just have your diatonic major scale. You follow with your chords if you want to put your long notes for your phrase structures. And then we just have the secondary 2-5s to bring in, hinting at those different keys as shown in the brackets. Our bridge is made up of extended dominant seventh chords. So we have the 5 of the 5 of the 5 of the 5 chord. So on these secondary dominant sevenths, you're playing Mixolydian scales. And you'll see every 2 bars we're changing that tonality. And on the final dominant seventh, we're back to the original tonality. It's the 5 leading us to the recap of the 1 chord. And then just like the beginning, the last 2 lines are like the beginning, are 1, or 2-5, and then we have our secondary 2-5 of the 2, the 5. The next line is shown in brackets. Is the secondary 2-5 of the 4 chord, and then we finally have the 2-5-1. So I'm going to give you a demonstration for once through, and then it's going to be your turn. Now it's worth noting this is a slightly altered version of the rhythm changes to accommodate the chords we've learned so far, and your choice of chord scale notes will even change further when we get into our next lesson. Okay, it's your turn, and as a reminder, we're going through 3 times. Two, three, 4. Now this is just the start to your bebop scales. It's very important to know your diatonic scales, so if you need to go back and play through those and get them fluent to your fingers. And next lesson we'll be introducing more types of colors to your chord scales, including tensions and altered tensions to really reflect each of these new types of chords. So I look forward to seeing you in lesson number 9. Bye for now.